A racist landlord thought he could illegally evict a black family from their home, but he never expected his discriminatory actions would lead to losing his own mansion in a stunning legal twist. The late August sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn of 1442 Oakwood Drive as Marcus Thompson stood before the elegant Tudor-style house, keys in hand. His dark skin glistened with a thin sheen of sweat from helping the movers, but his broad smile revealed nothing but pride and satisfaction. At 42, the accomplished black attorney had finally found what seemed like the perfect home for his family in the prestigious Oakwood Heights neighborhood. "Daddy, can I pick my room first?" 14-year-old Zara bounded up the front walkway, her braids bouncing with each step. Behind her, 10-year-old Xavier was already eyeing the massive oak tree in the front yard, no doubt calculating its climbing potential. "Let's wait for your mother," Marcus chuckled, watching as his wife Angela emerged from their SUV. Even after 15 years of marriage, the sight of her still made his heart skip a beat. She joined them on the front porch, interlacing her fingers with his. "It's perfect," Angela whispered, squeezing his hand. As a social worker who dedicated her life to helping underprivileged families find stable housing, she understood better than most the significance of this moment. They'd spent months searching for the right rental in this upscale neighborhood, wanting their children to have access to the best schools in the district. The sound of tires on gravel drew their attention to a midnight blue Mercedes pulling into the circular driveway. A tall, older white man in an expensive suit stepped out, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, despite the humid afternoon. This must be Richard Whitman, their new landlord. Marcus stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Whitman, I'm Marcus Thompson. We spoke on the phone about the lease." Richard's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he took in the family before him. His handshake was brief, barely a touch before he withdrew his hand. "Yes, well, I wasn't expecting—" He cleared his throat. "I mean, your voice on the phone. You didn't sound—" "Black?" Marcus finished pleasantly, maintaining his professional smile despite the all-too-familiar interaction. "I get that a lot in my line of work as a real estate attorney." Richard's jaw tightened. "You're an attorney?" "Going on 15 years now," Marcus replied, "specializing in real estate law, actually. One of the reasons I was so thorough in reviewing the lease agreement." "I see." Richard's tone had grown notably cooler. "Well, I just stopped by to ensure everything was in order. Remember, this is a quiet neighborhood. We have certain standards here." Angela stepped forward, her warm brown eyes meeting Richard's icy blue ones. "We're very familiar with the neighborhood standards, Mr. Whitman. I actually run several community outreach programs in the area." Richard's lip curled slightly. "How interesting." He turned back to Marcus. "The lease terms are very specific about noise levels, property maintenance, and the number of visitors allowed." Marcus kept his voice level, though he felt his children pressing closer to him. "We've reviewed all the terms carefully, Mr. Whitman. You'll find we're model tenants." "We'll see about that." Richard's gaze swept over the moving truck. "Just remember, I live right across the street. I'll be keeping an eye on things." With that, he turned and strode back to his car, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Xavier tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, why was that man so mean?" Marcus exchanged a look with Angela before kneeling beside his son. "Some people, son, take time to see past their own prejudices. The best thing we can do is prove them wrong by being exactly who we are, proud, successful, and deserving of every good thing that comes our way." Over the next few weeks, the Thompsons settled into their new home, but Richard Whitman's surveillance became increasingly obvious and intrusive. He seemed to appear whenever they had visitors, taking photos with his phone and making notes. When Angela hosted a small book club meeting, Richard called the police reporting a suspicious gathering. The responding officers, finding nothing but 6 women discussing Toni Morrison over tea, apologized profusely. Marcus began documenting every interaction, his legal instincts telling him something wasn't right. He noticed Richard watching other houses too, particularly the few that had non-white residents. One evening, while walking their dog, Marcus struck up a conversation with Mrs. Patel from 3 doors down. "Oh, yes," she said in hushed tones, glancing nervously at Richard's mansion across the street. "He tried to evict us last year, claiming we were violating the lease by cooking ethnic food that he said was decreasing property values. We had to hire a lawyer to fight it." Similar conversations with other neighbors revealed a pattern. A Hispanic family had been evicted for unauthorized renovations when they installed security cameras. An elderly black couple had their lease terminated for excessive gatherings. They had hosted their grandchildren for Sunday dinners. One Saturday morning, As Marcus watched Xavier playing basketball in their driveway, he noticed Richard taking more photos. Minutes later, a police car pulled up. "We received a complaint about unauthorized sports equipment on the property," the officer said apologetically, gesturing to the portable basketball hoop. Marcus smiled tightly. "Officer, I'd be happy to show you Section 8.3 of our lease agreement, which explicitly permits recreational equipment in the driveway. I have a copy right here." He retrieved the document from his home office, watching Richard's scowl deepen from across the street. The officer reviewed the lease and nodded. "Everything appears to be in order, sir. Sorry for the disturbance." That evening, Marcus sat in his home office, reviewing his growing file of documented incidents. Angela entered with 2 cups of tea, setting one beside him. "You've got that look," she said, perching on the edge of his desk. "The one you get when you're building a case." Marcus nodded grimly. "Something's not right here, Angela. The way he's targeting minority residents, the arbitrary enforcement of rules, the constant surveillance. I'm going to do some deeper digging into Mr. Whitman's real estate holdings." A sharp knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Through the security camera, they saw Richard Whitman standing on their porch, a thick envelope in his hands. Marcus opened the door, Angela beside him. Richard thrust the envelope forward without preamble. "This is a notice of eviction," he announced, a smug smile playing at his lips. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises." Marcus maintained his composure as he opened the envelope. "On what grounds?" "Violation of lease terms, unauthorized modifications to the property, excessive noise, improper use of common areas, and multiple complaints from neighbors." Richard's smile widened. "I've documented everything." "Have you now?" Marcus's voice was deadly calm as he scanned the notice. "And these neighbor complaints? And would these be the same neighbors who've shared their own experiences with your discriminatory practices?" Richard's smile faltered slightly. "I don't know what you're implying, but I suggest you focus on finding new housing arrangements. This neighborhood clearly isn't the right fit for your family." "Oh, I disagree," Marcus replied, his legal training evident in his measured tone. "I think we're exactly where we need to be, Mr. Whitman. You'll be hearing from my office regarding this notice." "Your office?" Richard scoffed. "You really think you can fight this? I own half the properties in this neighborhood. I have connections with every real estate agency and property management company in the city. Good luck finding another place to live once I'm done with you." As Richard turned to leave, Marcus called after him. "Mr. Whitman, you might want to familiarize yourself with the Fair Housing Act and perhaps take a closer look at who you're trying to evict, because this black family you're targeting, we're not going anywhere." Marcus closed the door and turned to Angela, who had witnessed the entire exchange. Their children stood at the top of the stairs, worry evident on their faces. "It's okay," Marcus assured them all, his mind already formulating a plan. "Mr. Whitman just made a very big mistake." Later that night, after the children were in bed, Marcus sat at his desk, the eviction notice spread out before him. His computer screen glowed with property records, tax assessments, and a growing list of former tenants. With each document he reviewed, each connection he uncovered, his determination grew stronger. Richard Whitman had no idea who he was dealing with. This wasn't just about their family anymore. It was about every family this man had ever discriminated against. As Marcus began drafting his response to the eviction notice, he allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes karma needed a little legal expertise to work its magic. Marcus Thompson sat in his downtown office, surrounded by stacks of documents and screenshots from housing discrimination forums. His colleague, James Martinez, stood at the whiteboard, mapping out connections between Richard Whitman's various property holdings. "It's worse than we thought," James said, circling another LLC name. "Whitman's been operating under at least 12 different company names. Every time he gets hit with a discrimination complaint, he dissolves the company and transfers the properties to a new one." Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He'd spent the past week diving deep into Whitman's history, and each discovery made his blood boil. "How many cases?" "That we found so far? 27 families in the last 5 years, all minorities, all evicted under suspicious circumstances." James capped his marker. "But here's the kicker. Most of them never fought back because they couldn't afford legal representation." A knock at the office door interrupted them. Sarah Chen from the Fair Housing Authority stood in the doorway, clutching a thick file folder. Her face was grim. "You're going to want to see this," she said, spreading documents across Marcus's desk. "We've been building a case against Whitman for months, but we couldn't prove the connection between his different companies. Your complaint finally gave us the thread we needed to start pulling." As Marcus reviewed the documents, his eyes widened. The discrimination wasn't just about evictions, it was systematic. Whitman had been charging higher security deposits to minority applicants, requiring additional credit checks, and losing applications from qualified non-white candidates. Marcus's phone buzzed, a text from Angela. He's here again, third time today. Since serving them with the eviction notice, Richard had escalated his harassment. He'd installed floodlights pointing directly at their bedroom windows, called code enforcement daily with bogus complaints, and even hired landscapers to start work at 5 a.m. directly outside their children's rooms. I need to get home, Marcus said, gathering the documents. Sarah, can you send me everything you have on his property transfers? I think I'm seeing a pattern with the timing. When Marcus arrived home, he found Angela in heated discussion with two police officers on their front lawn. Richard stood nearby, arms crossed smugly. What's going on? Marcus demanded, rushing to his wife's side. Mr. Whitman claims we violated our lease by installing security cameras without permission. One officer explained, looking uncomfortable. He's demanding they be removed immediately. Marcus pulled out his phone, quickly pulling up the lease agreement. Section 12.4 specifically permits security devices that don't cause permanent damage. Would you like to see the clause? The officers exchanged glances. That won't be necessary, sir. Mr. Whitman, this appears to be a civil matter. Richard's face reddened. They're spying on me. They've got cameras pointed at my house. Our cameras point at our own property, Mr. Whitman, Angela replied calmly. Perhaps you're thinking of your own cameras? The ones you installed last week pointing directly at our children's windows? The officers turned to Richard. Sir, that could be considered harassment. I suggest you leave the premises. Richard stormed off, but not before shouting, This isn't over. You people don't belong here. Later that evening, Marcus sat with Zara and Xavier in the living room, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy as they worked on homework. Angela was upstairs on the phone with their insurance company. Richard had filed yet another fraudulent claim, this time alleging they damaged the hardwood floors. Dad, Zara said quietly, some kids at school said Mr. Whitman's been telling people we're squatters. Jenny's mom won't let her come over anymore. Marcus set down his laptop, his heart heavy. Come here, both of you. He pulled his children close. What Mr. Whitman is doing is wrong. It's illegal, and it's based on ignorance and hate, but we're not going to let him win. You know why? Because we didn't do anything wrong? Xavier offered. That's right. And because people like Mr. Whitman count on their targets giving up and going away quietly. But we're not going to do that. We're going to stand up not just for ourselves, but for everyone else he's hurt. The next morning, Marcus was in the shower when he heard Angela scream. He rushed downstairs, still dripping, to find her at the front door, or rather trying to open it. The locks had been changed. Richard stood on their front lawn, surrounded by a team of workers. The lease has been terminated, he shouted. I'm executing my right to secure the property. Marcus, now dressed, emerged onto the front porch through the back door. Sarah, he spoke into his phone. Are you getting this? Yes, send them right away. He turned to Richard. What you're doing is called a self-help eviction. It's illegal in this state. You have exactly 5 minutes to restore our access before I call the police and file for emergency injunctive relief. You've been served with an eviction notice, Richard spat. Which we contested, Marcus replied calmly, recording everything on his phone. There's been no court hearing, no judgment. This is a textbook illegal lockout. Within 20 minutes, the street was filled with police cars and a news van. Sarah Chin had arrived with a housing authority team documenting everything. Richard was forced to have the locks changed back, his face purple with rage. But the incident proved to be a turning point. Other residents began coming forward, sharing their own stories of discrimination. Sarah's investigation expanded, revealing a pattern going back decades. Richard hadn't just been discriminating against minorities. He'd been running a complex scheme to artificially inflate property values by keeping certain neighborhoods exclusive. Marcus worked late into the night, building his case. The evidence was damning. Falsified documents, discriminatory policies hidden behind shell companies, and a web of financial transactions designed to hide the true ownership of properties. We've got him, Sarah announced one evening, bursting into Marcus's office. We found the smoking gun. Remember those property transfers? He's been avoiding taxes by undervaluing properties when selling them between his companies. The IRS is very interested. But Richard wasn't going down without a fight. The next day, while Marcus was at court filing injunction paperwork, Richard arrived at the house with a moving team. Angela was working from home when she heard the commotion. She found Richard and three men attempting to carry their dining room table out the front door. "Stop right there," she commanded, her phone already recording. "This is breaking and entering." "I have every right to remove squatters' property," Richard sneered. "This is my house." "Mom?" Zara's voice came from upstairs. She and Xavier had just gotten home from school. "What's happening?" "Stay upstairs," Angela ordered, positioning herself between the stairs and the intruders. She pressed the panic button on their security system and dialed 911. Richard advanced toward her. "You people are all the same. Think you can come into decent neighborhoods and take what isn't yours? Well, I'm taking my property back." "Step back, Mr. Whitman," Angela warned, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The police are on their way, and everything you're doing is being recorded and live streamed." Sure enough, several neighbors had gathered outside, phones raised. Mrs. Patel was narrating everything for her live stream, and the Martinez family from next door had positioned themselves at the doorway, preventing the moving team from carrying out any more furniture. Richard looked around, suddenly realizing he had an audience, his face contorted with rage as he heard approaching sirens. "This isn't over," he hissed, backing toward the door. "You think you can beat me? I own this neighborhood. I have friends in high places. You have no idea what you're dealing with." As Richard retreated to his car, Marcus's SUV screeched into the driveway. He ran to Angela, gathering her and the children in his arms as police cars surrounded the house. Later that night, after giving statements to the police and calming the children, Marcus and Angela sat in their partially disrupted living room. The dining room table had been returned to its place, a small scratch the only evidence of its brief journey. "He's desperate," Marcus observed, reviewing the security footage. "He knows we're close to something big." Angela squeezed his hand. "What are you thinking?" Marcus's eyes narrowed as he watched Richard's rage-filled face on the screen. "I'm thinking it's time to show him exactly what he's dealing with. Tomorrow, we go nuclear." He pulled out his phone and dialed Sarah Chen's number. "Sarah? Yeah, it happened just like we expected. Get everyone ready. Tomorrow we file everything." As he hung up, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Richard Whitman had just made his final mistake, and he didn't even know it yet. The courthouse steps were crowded with news cameras and reporters as Marcus Thompson ascended them, briefcase in hand. Behind him walked a diverse group of families: the Patels, the Garcias, the Wongs, and dozens more, each carrying their own stories of discrimination at the hands of Richard Whitman. Inside the courtroom, Richard sat with his team of expensive lawyers, his usual smugness somewhat diminished by the sight of the packed gallery. His eyes widened as Sarah Chen entered with a team of federal agents and IRS investigators carrying boxes of documents. Judge Miranda Henderson called the court to order. "We're here today for Thompson et al. Versus Whitman Properties LLC and associated entities. Mr. Thompson, you may proceed with your opening statement." Marcus stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the jury. "Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is about more than just housing discrimination. It's about a systematic, decades-long campaign to maintain what Mr. Whitman calls neighborhood character, a euphemism for keeping minorities out of wealthy communities through illegal and predatory practices." He gestured to the families in the gallery. "Every person in this courtroom has a story about Richard Whitman. Some were charged excessive fees because of their ethnicity. Others had their rental applications mysteriously lost. Many were illegally evicted when they refused to be intimidated into leaving." Richard shifted uncomfortably as Marcus continued. "But Mr. Whitman made a crucial mistake. When he targeted my family, he didn't realize he was exposing a pattern of discrimination that would bring down his entire operation. Today, we will prove not only his violations of the Fair Housing Act, but also reveal a complex web of tax fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy." Over the next several hours, Marcus methodically presented his case. Sarah Chen testified about the Housing Authority's investigation, revealing hundreds of discriminatory incidents across Whitman's properties. Financial experts detailed how Richard had used shell companies to hide his assets and evade millions in taxes. "Mr. Whitman," Marcus began during cross-examination, "could you explain why your company charges an average security deposit of 1 month's rent to white tenants, but requires 3 months' rent from minorities?" "That's not true," Richard sputtered. "We have a standard policy." Marcus produced a stack of lease agreements. Exhibit 47, Your Honor, a statistical analysis of every lease agreement from the past 5 years, showing a clear pattern of discriminatory pricing. As Richard's face reddened, Marcus pressed on. And could you explain why your shell company, Whitman Holdings LLC, sold the Oakwood Heights properties to another shell company, Whitman Investments LLC, for 1/3 of their market value? That was a legitimate business transaction. A legitimate transaction designed to avoid paying proper taxes? Marcus raised an eyebrow. Or perhaps it was to hide assets from discrimination lawsuits. The testimony of Richard's former employees proved devastating. His personal assistant revealed how she'd been instructed to lose applications from minority applicants. A maintenance worker described being told to ignore repair requests from non-white tenants. But the most powerful testimony came from the victims themselves. Mrs. Patel described how her children had cried when they were forced to leave their home based on false accusations. Mr. Garcia explained how his family had become homeless for 3 months after an illegal eviction. During a brief recess, Angela squeezed Marcus's hand. "You're destroying him," she whispered. Marcus nodded grimly. He's about to learn that karma has a law degree. When Richard took the stand again, Marcus was ready. "Mr. Whitman, are you familiar with the Lincoln Heights apartments?" Richard paled slightly. "Yes, I owned that property briefly." "Briefly?" Marcus clicked a button projecting documents onto the courtroom screen. "According to these records, you've owned it through various shell companies for 15 years, during which time you collected over $5 million in Section 8 housing payments while providing substandard housing to low-income tenants." "Objection." Richard's lawyer stood. "Relevance?" "Your Honor," Marcus replied, "I'm establishing a pattern of fraudulent behavior that extends beyond simple discrimination. Mr. Whitman hasn't just been violating the Fair Housing Act, he's been defrauding the federal government." "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Thompson." By the time Marcus finished his examination, Richard's carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely. His own testimony had revealed inconsistencies that even his expensive legal team couldn't explain away. During closing arguments, Marcus addressed the jury with quiet intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard overwhelming evidence of Mr. Whitman's discriminatory practices, but this case represents something larger than one man's prejudice. It's about justice for hundreds of families who were denied their basic right to fair housing. It's about holding accountable those who believe their wealth and privilege put them above the law." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On the charge of systematic housing discrimination, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges of tax evasion and fraud, we find the defendant guilty. The list of guilty verdicts continued, each one driving another nail into the coffin of Richard's real estate empire. Judge Henderson's sentence was equally comprehensive. "Mr. Whitman, your actions represent a gross violation of civil rights and federal law. This court orders the following. All your properties are to be seized and placed under receivership. You are ordered to pay $50 million in damages to the victims of your discrimination. Additionally, your personal assets will be frozen pending further investigation by the IRS and Department of Justice." Richard slumped in his chair as the judge continued. "Furthermore, your primary residence at 1443 Oakwood Drive is hereby seized and will be converted into a community center and affordable housing complex to be managed by the Fair Housing Authority." As Richard was led away by federal agents, he passed Marcus and his family. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "All of you." Marcus smiled. "No, Mr. Whitman. The only regret here is that it took so long to bring you to justice." 3 months later, the Thompson family stood in front of 1443 Oakwood Drive, Richard's former mansion. The Oakwood Heights Community Center and Housing Complex sign gleamed in the morning sun. Sarah Chenna handed Marcus a set of keys. "As lead counsel in the case and a victim of discrimination, your family has first choice of the renovated units. We've converted the main house into 4 spacious apartments, with the ground floor serving as a community center." Angela wiped away tears as they toured their new home, the entire top floor of the mansion, with a view of the neighborhood Richard had once claimed they didn't belong in. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "Where's Mr. Whitman now?" Xavier asked as he explored his new room. "Last I heard," Marcus replied, "he's renting a 1-bedroom apartment downtown while awaiting his criminal trial. Turns out karma doesn't just come around, sometimes it kicks you out of your own house." That evening, the Thompsons hosted a housewarming party. The Patels, Garcias, Wongs, and other families from the lawsuit filled the community center. Children played in the sprawling backyard, where Richard had once hosted exclusive garden parties. Marcus stood on the balcony, watching the diverse group of neighbors chatting and laughing together. Angela joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You did it," she said proudly. You turned his weapon of discrimination into a force for good. We did it, Marcus corrected her. Every family that stood up, every person who testified, we all did this together. Below them, Mrs. Patel was teaching Zara how to rap a sarzi, while Xavier played basketball with the Garcia kids on the new community court. The sound of their laughter echoed across the property that had once symbolized exclusion and now represented hope. Sarah Chen approached them with a glass of champagne. The other properties are being converted too. By next year, we'll have created affordable housing for over 300 families. And the best part? Marcus grinned. The rental applications are completely bias-free. Everyone gets a fair chance. Exactly what the Fair Housing Act intended. As the sun set over Oakwood Heights, casting a golden glow on the community center that had once been a monument to discrimination, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Richard Whitman had tried to evict one black family and ended up losing everything. But in losing his empire of hate, he had inadvertently created something beautiful, a truly inclusive community where everyone belonged. You know what they say, Angela mused, watching a group of children from different backgrounds playing together on the lawn. Karma doesn't just come around. It comes home. Marcus finished, pulling his wife closer and savoring the sweet taste of justice served.